Great, off you go. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you, Kate. All
Great.
right, we can start without any further ado. So I call forth Gilles van Mulders to present basic versus mentalistic ostension, meta-communicating without representing. Here you go.
Okay, so hi everyone. So today I wanted to share with you my latest thoughts and reflections around Sperber and Wilson's latest distinction about basic and mentalistic ostension in their recent preprint that was submitted. First of all, we're going to go through briefly into these notions before going into evidence from comparative cognition on what appears to be shared or not between primates and humans. Well, non-human primates and humans. Next, we will dive into a case study of the panthoot in chimpanzees before trying to apply this recent framework of Sperber and Wilson to this example. So first of all, traditionally in relevance theory, animal communicative signals have been accounted for as cases of pure determinate showing. So here on this bidimensional square around the number 7, where basically the axis between determinacy and indeterminacy qualifies how the intended import is more or less manifest and attributable to the speaker, whereas this other axis between showing and meaning or saying, also known as directedness or indirectedness, describes how the evidence requires more or less meta-representational steps to derive its meaning. So basically, it has then been proposed, namely by Wharton, to account for these signals as in terms of natural codes, as encoding procedural meaning, since they are phylogenetically encoded, but yet can somehow, to a certain extent, which is still debated, be produced intentionally. There's also the question of whether they are reducible to an attitude. So traditionally, this account relies on coded communication, so not inferential, not propositional. But what changes with Sperber and Wilson's latest distinction is that they recognize that ostension may be playing a part in intentional communication without it needing to be necessarily mentalistic. So basically the difference between the two is that basic ostension is only about meta-communication, whereas mentalistic ostension is about both meta-communicating and meta-representing. So that instead of being more or less determinate but strictly direct in mentalistic ostension, the range of what can be communicated is much broader, as the meaning can be more or less determinate and more or less direct. So instead of purporting only on immediate contextual information, it also it can also take into account non-immediate contextual information, top-down stimuli that are linked with consciousness access. And contrarily to basic ostension, there is an actual need to infer the sender's intention, as the contents cannot be accessed directly with observational evidence, but rather need to be interpreted. This observational evidence requires a further interpretational step to access the meaning. So now, if we compare quickly between what is shared and what isn't shared between cognitive systems, so all of these cognitive features that you see on this slide are common, but they differ in degree and in complexity. So that is to say, in the size and connectivity of neural networks. Namely, the control of the vocal tract is more limited in non-human primates than in humans, with call initiation being controlled, but call shape being phylogenetically determined. There's also an active role of the prefrontal cortex linked with planification, inhibition, cognitive flexibility, and more broadly has been theorized as being linked to theory of mind abilities. The cerebellum, responsible for prosody, rhythms, and syntax, and mirror neuron systems, which link perception to actions, And basically because they are less connected to linguistic areas, it is thought that they account for this difference between simple goal-orientedness and more complex goal-orientedness with complex mental states being embedded into one another. So what appears to be human-specific are three core characteristics, namely compositionality, expressive power, and the full-fledged theory of mind, which all relate to metacognitive abilities. So the ability to yield potentially infinitely recursive intentional embeddings. However, this highly intellectualized version of metacognition, as is represented on the picture on the right, has been debated and criticized more prominently because it has been shown experimentally that adult humans have some troubles with fourth order and beyond intentional representations. So on the other hand, what is shared is again a matter of degree rather than a strict nature difference, in the sense that there is considerable evidence of first order intentionality in many species, and especially in primates, which has been operationalized around behaviors, so without the need to infer mental states. However, there are very scarce but rather convincing evidence, namely in Crockford and colleagues 2012, that chimpanzees are able to selectively inform an ignorant group member of danger, and hence are able to recognize knowledge and ignorance in others. Similarly, in Shell and colleagues 2013, they showed that chimpanzees were able to selectively direct food calls at specific individuals using their gaze and taking into account high ranking and or kinship social statuses. So another feature that appears to be shared, as mentioned in Sperber and Wilson 2015, is ostension, with gaze increasing salience, goal-directedness, again in the broad sense of being about something, and coordinating abilities, namely the ability to monitor each other's mutual involvement in a joint action. Now, I just wanted to go through a quick theoretical consideration, namely the fact that calls and gestures have not been researched from the same basis, with vocal communication having been studies as being used to influence the mental states of receivers, where gestural communication was more broadly investigated as goal-directedness and hence intentional. So there wasn't the same definition of intentionality for the two modalities. And what I find interesting with that is that this difference in treatment kind of echoes the new distinction of Sperber and Wilson between basic and mentalistic communication. So I wanted to also pay some attention to a notion that has received considerable interest in the last decades, namely functionally referential signals, which are sequential and context-specific, and they have been thought to be equivalents of the linguistic lexicon with the object and referent mapping. But this has been largely debunked, and it has instead been proposed to look at context-dependent signals, so signals that are being used in many different contexts and in which there is possible enrichment of meaning in context. So just to give you a quick idea of what chimpanzees' repertoire can look like, so not all of the vocalization are represented here, but you can see that there are single units call type on the left and its variants or associated contexts on the right. And we're going to focus on the example of the pant hoot, which is a long-distance contact call sequence, which is built from 2 single units, but contain 4 phases: an introduction, a build-up, a climax, and a let-down. So it's highly graded, idiosyncratic, and context-dependent in the sense that it can be used across many contexts, namely travel, food, resting, nesting, waiting, within and between group aggression. And it's just important to note that the only context in which the call is acoustically perceptually different is during travel contexts. It has also recently been proposed that this call may be compositional in Girard-Buteau and colleagues 2025, meaning that the meaning is determined by the meanings of the parts and the rules used to combine them. And I'm also asking myself the question of whether it contains any sort of conceptual content. So the status is very unclear, but it seems to include some form of broad general conceptual content linked with affiliation, the location, the sender identity, and recruitment. So now, just to give you a quick idea of what the Panthoot looks like. Let's remove it down. And so in here, of course, in here, I've represented the possible content of that call in a very conceptualistic way, which, I mean, I'm not expecting to find these propositions in that very linguistic format in the mind of the chimpanzees. I'm just using propositions as a human-specific mode of meta-representation. And I have divided them into into 2 categories, one that can be accounted for in terms of simple goal directedness, and the other one in which maybe some intention attribution may be needed. So for instance, she thinks that these fruits will be appreciated by the individuals in her colony. And the broader question I'm asking myself is, as this is a long distance call, and as her peers are not present to witness direct contextual evidence besides hearing the call, how do they reach the meaning that this Panthoot means I found a new fruit tree and all the possible other information that goes along with it, instead of I want to nest or I want to rest, I am waiting, etc. And are schemas enough to account for such such complexity? So I just quickly also wanted to go through some simpler explanations that are usually given when it is possible to give simpler explanation than intention attribution to these behaviors. So they are mainly linked to conditioning, be it contextual, behavioral, again, or ritualized through repetition, like in schemas. There's also the idea of affective cueing, where one responds to emotional tone rather than to semantic content. And so keeping that in mind, we have here, I wanted to go through the latest evidence on compositionality, which I believe kind of complexifies the whole picture with, on one hand, a study by Berthet and colleagues on bonobos, in which they assessed each call type of the bonobos repertoire and found that all of them occur in at least one compositional combination, either trivial or non-trivial. And also another species in which, study in which I will dive into a little bit more detail by Girard-Buteau and colleagues, in which they also assessed the entire chimpanzee vocal repertoire and created 16 bigrams in which they found also all 4 types of either non-compositional, where new meaning is formed, use, and the 3 types of compositional uses here and there on the number 2, 3, and 4, namely meaning modification, clarification, where contexts are narrowed down, and meaning combination, where so the meaning of the two single units are combined to yield a different context use, and as well as ordering effects. So to give you a quick example, the Panthut is used in at least 4 different compositional sequences. So we're going to focus on the Panthut who. Just bear in mind that hoot and who are different single units, and that the Panthut can sometimes be studied as a single unit or already as a sequence. So in this study, they decided to study it as a single unit. So we have the Panthut occurring with other single units. So with Panthut who, we have both, as well as with who Panthut, so the order reversed. We have both meaning clarification, as they are not used in all of the contexts in which the single units are used, but we also have meaning combination in the sense that they are used in other contexts than the single units. And between the two ordered sequence, they are not used in the same contexts either, meaning that they are all very distinct from one another. Another thing to bear in mind, just to give an idea of how complex this might be, is the fact that here, so they studied bigrams, so sequences of 2 calls combined together. But actually, there is considerable evidence that chimpanzees produce hundreds of different vocal sequences and can combine up to 8 different vocal units within the same sequence. And in other animals, compositionality has been evidenced in quite a few species as well, although obviously never to the same extent than what is found in humans. So namely in some birds, in some monkeys, and in humpback whales. And theory of mind up to the first order, with second order and above being more than debated. So first order intentionality has been found as well in different types of bird and corvids, in dogs and dolphins. So what do we do with all of this information? Basically, on one hand, we have some evidence that tells us that these calls are not propositions, that they may lack conceptual content and be reducible to an attitude, that even if there is some flexible use, their meaning is largely constrained by specific contextual use. They are phylogenetically encoded signals, so not conventionalized. Does that mean that they're automatic? And there's obviously the problem of mental states not being empirically observable, contrarily to behaviors. So this also leads to some theoretical confounds where we have somehow a circular way of defining things, with inferring the meaning of a call based on how others respond to it in context. And so how do we infer whether the intention and the context are overlapping two different things? It's a very difficult field, but considering that even though it is rather scarce, there is some rather convincing evidence both of mental state attribution, so the ability to change knowledge and beliefs, and some compositionality rather than simple combinatoriality, where single units do not have a meaning and can be combined linearly, so not depending on rules. So as we have this, what do we do exactly, and how can we characterize this Panthut? Because traditionally, as it is a pure case of determinate showing, what do we do with the fact that the meaning may not be fully determinate and needs to be disambiguated in context? Is observational evidence and schemas enough to account for this? And on the other hand, they may not strictly be instances of showing either, which in the sense that they seem to bear some form of conceptual content as well, which also needs disambiguation or enrichment in context. So how do we account for this? So I've been thinking, so this is again very much a work in progress, but I've been trying to see whether observational evidence was enough to disambiguate between discourse and context. And so what I found is that by attributing some valence and intensity to each call in context, I wanted to see whether emotional cueing would be enough to disambiguate. And for now, I have the impression that it does not fully account for this complexity, in the sense that for within group aggression, between group aggression, caller identity, which is observational, might be enough to disambiguate. For travel, since it's acoustically distinct as well. But for all the other contexts here, since the emotional valence and intensity considerably overlap, how do they interpret the meanings of the call in context? And maybe they might need some interpretational evidence that they retrieve from their long-term or medium-term memory, as this kind of calls upon the ability to keep in mind the whereabouts of their peers and with whom they went where for what. So yeah, this is kind of the latest observation I've been making and questioning, because it's not paradigmatic or straightforward. And what I also find interesting is that panthoots are never produced as a response to known social stimulus, like they just find food and they do panthoot without directing it at someone. This happens, for instance, with food grunts, but never with panthoots, because it's always requiring some kind of contact. So all of this leaves us with some different questions, namely, what do we do with this question of immediate versus non-immediate contextual information and where pragmatic enrichment might be needed? The question of the role of emotionality as well, and how do we observe affective effects, namely secondary affective effects arising from the comprehension of the call? Are there really secondary affective effects, or simply contagion, emotional contagion processes? And do they need to meta-represent the intention of the other to arrive at the meaning of the call? Can it be minimally mentalistic, or does basic extension and schemas really account for this amount of contextual flexibility? So in order to address these questions, I find two models really interesting. First one is the associative models, which have been also theorized by Mazzone to apply it to the pragmatics field, where basically, as this is based on conditioning and deconditioned or conditioned associations plus the competition of these associations, it has been proposed that this may be equivalent to inferences. And the strength of this model is that it can account both for the automatic and for the controlled processes, and that it enables between species comparison. And the other model I found deeply interesting is that of core knowledge systems, which are theorized as non-propositional knowledge systems involving different kinds of representations. So kind of like Chomsky postulated innate blank systems that are ready for certain types of information. Here, Spelke and colleagues have postulated that these are all 5 dimensions of cognition that are ancient and shared across species, namely that of object representation, agent, quantitative, spatial, and social representation, though the last one is still a bit debated. So to conclude, the picture I have built here kind of gives us an idea of evolution being either continuous or convergent, but in all cases involving a certain kind of continuum between humans and other species. I'm also really wondering about the question of the symbolic reference gap. So is there a gradient to that? How do we operationalize it? Can we really account for automatic processes as being inferential? And what do we do with emotionality? Are there procedures to infer context? And to what extent is that inferential as well? So a few possible directions for future research are to implement more the associative model into relevance theory, as this potentially opens the way to study emotionality and procedural meaning variation in another way than what has been done up until now. I'm also wondering about how to define exactly directness, and how it is linked to symbolic reference, because, for instance, the case of pointing, even though it is highly conventionalized, relies somehow on the idea that, well, on the symbolic reference between the point and looking somewhere else, because a lot of animals haven't acquired it and just look at the finger. So is that already a meta-representational step that has just been routinely acquired and conventionalized? And yeah, does that, again, the same question of can automatic processes be inferential? And I just wanted also to quickly mention 4 ways of testing intention attribution, namely the violation of expectation paradigm, the false belief test for receivers, differential response to deceptive intent, and the last one, which is kind of the direction that I'm taking, is how individuals respond to ostensive cues as ambiguous signals. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much, Jill, for your presentation. We have 2 minutes for quick questions to stay on schedule. So anyone who wants. Oh, Eduardo, I see you, Eduardo. I mean, I don't see any other hands
sorry,
raised.
I didn't manage to raise my hand in the screen. So thank you, Jill, for this very rich and interesting presentation. So I have a kind of direct question. So I was wondering, would, according to you, punchhood be considered as an ostensive behavior? And if so, on the basis of which criteria can we define it as an ostensive?
So, as I've mentioned, the punchhood is never produced only as a response to non-social stimuli. Like, it's always directed at peers because it's a contact call specifically. So even though others may be far away, it's meant to contact others in contrast with, for instance, food grunts, which one finds food, they're excited about the food and they do a food grunt. But this doesn't happen with the punchhood. So yeah, I believe it's an ostensive signal in itself, quite by definition.
Okay, so on the basis of the fact that it is addressed to someone, even for the audience, so the receiver, the specific, there is no specific receiver, but it's like a more wide range of receiver.
Wide, but it can also be directed at specific receivers in the case, for instance, of nesting, where they might direct punchhood at one specific individual, and the others have to infer that it's not directed at them, even though it's a very loud contact call that everyone is able to hear.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.